Hi, my name is Autif Kamal, and this is episode 30 of Be Logical. This one is about Tamerlan Tsarnaev. He was one of the bombing suspects for the Boston Marathon, and his uncle had been trying, it seems like, for at least a week to find a cemetery that would accept Tamerlan's body, but every cemetery he was going to would reject him, or reject burying Tamerlan's body. And Robert Healy has an explanation for this. Robert Healy is a Cambridge city manager, and he distributes burial permits. This is why he was advising the uncle against burying Tamerlan's body in Boston. The difficult and stressful efforts of the citizens of the city of Cambridge to return to a peaceful life would be adversely impacted by the turmoil, protests, and a widespread media presence at such an interment. And I'm getting this quote from the article Uncle Arranging Boston Bomb Suspect's Burial Rites. It was written by Denise Lavoie. She writes for the Associated Press. Okay. Now, I have a number of arguments for why I disagree with Robert Healy. Now, first off, so Robert assumes that there would be widespread media presence at Tamerlan's grave. That's possible, but they're not going to simply record his grave because there's no activity in that. And also, I'm not yet convinced that there'd be a protest just to have his grave there. Another assumption I think that Robert makes is that Cambridge citizens will continue to pay attention to media coverage of Tamerlan. And the reason why I'm not convinced by that is because if they keep thinking about Tamerlan and the Boston bombing tragedy that he's connected to, they'll just keep getting sad by thinking about it, or a lot of people will, or angry. But if they stop thinking about it, they can move on and end their continuous state of sadness and anger. Also, something you have to keep in mind is that in general, like, nothing lasts forever. That goes along with a person's attention span too. If they watch the same thing for too long, they'll eventually get bored. And if they get bored, then I would assume the media would lose ratings. So then that would push them, the media, to move on to other stories that people would find more interesting. Also, another assumption is that if there are protests, people will care. I'm not at all convinced by that because, again, if they get bored, they're not going to look at these protests. And if they're not going to look at these protests, they wouldn't be distressed by them. Now, the only possible argument someone could give for Tamerlan not being buried in Boston is that we don't like him. They would say it in a much more verbose way than that. They might say, like, oh, he's a terrible mass murderer, but that's just a fancy way to say that we don't like him. And yeah, that's not good enough. Oh, and also something else you have to keep in mind is that I think it's likely, this is my speculation, that there are other criminals buried in Boston cemeteries, and just because you don't like a criminal, just because that criminal is widely disliked, doesn't mean you can say he shouldn't be buried there because I don't like him. It's the same idea. Also, pretend that Tamerlan was a rich philanthropist, and he made schools, he made hospitals, and like homeless shelters, and so on. Let's pretend he was universally agreed to be a good person. Everyone would appreciate him, and so there would be no objections to his burial in Boston. And because they appreciate him, they would like him. And so that just emphasizes the idea that whether they would agree to bury him or not would be arbitrary based on whether they like him or not. And yeah, you can't use it as a basis to bury or not bury someone. Also, if you look at burial regulations as described by the Bureau of Consumer Protection in their business center, if you go online, they have a document called Complying with the Funeral Rule, and this is a quote that I got from them. Impossible, impractical, or excessively burdensome requests. You, as in the funeral provider, do not have to comply with such requests. However, you cannot refuse a request simply because you do not like it or don't approve of it. So again, to reinforce the point that, well, at least from the funeral provider's point of view, he or she cannot refuse someone's request to bury someone else just because they don't like it. Now, there is a serious and I think feasible concern that there might be vandals who would come and tear up the cemetery that Tamerlan would be buried in. But there's a solution to that. If they can't identify Tamerlan's grave, then they won't know where to vandalize. So then what I would suggest be done is that his grave should be unmarked, and then once it's clear that attention over Tamerlan has died down, those who care about him could go back to his grave and then mark it appropriately with like his first name, last name, birth, and death. Yeah, so that would be my solution to the worry of vandals, and those are all of my arguments against the idea that Tamerlan should not be buried in Boston. But I think he's already been buried now, but nonetheless, that's my response. Alright, thank you.